Good evening, everyone, first of all. Hello, grüß Gott, habideri, and thank you so much for coming out on a Friday evening. I know that Munich at the moment is having a bit of fun with the Frühlingsfest, so I'm so grateful that a few of you at least have come to come and hear me speak tonight. It is absolutely a privilege to be here on the invitation of the Forum Queeres Archiv München, and as I said before, habideri, I was in Passau for a while. That was my first academic post in Germany, where I learned this great greeting, habideri, ich hab die Ehre. The honor very definitely is mine to be here tonight, so thank you. I just want to briefly introduce myself before we get into the presentation this evening. My name is Bodie A. Ashton. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am, as you can tell by the accent and also by the name, not a German. I am an Australian. I'm also British, but I am Australian mostly. And I've been in Germany since 2016, where I worked in Passau at the university there, and I now work in a Volkswagen Stiftung funded project called the Other Global Germany at the Universität Erfurt, where our focus is on criminality, deviance in inverted commas, and the constructions of these things and illicitness, with Germany at the core of a globalized phenomenon. So I work there as one of three historians. The group leader is a Canadian by the name of Ned Richardson Little. He looks at drugs and weapons and gun smuggling and cocaine smuggling and all of those fun sort of things. And my other colleague, Sarah Franking, focuses mostly on sex work, so-called white slavery, and the trafficking of people along the Franco-German borders. My focus, however, is on the queer historical component for that project, which leads me into what I'll be talking about this evening. My specific focus is on trans identities and gender nonconforming identities in the so-called German 20th century. You can also, as you can maybe see up there, you can also find me on Twitter, where I tend to swear and yell an awful lot. So if that's your sort of thing, you can absolutely follow me. Just also a note, because I don't have the controls for my slideshow up here, every time I need to say next slide, I will say next slide, and we'll get to the next one. So that might interrupt the talk just a little bit, but don't be too surprised by that. And speaking of which, next slide, please. So I want to start tonight by giving you an ending of sorts, or an epilogue, so to speak. I want to briefly introduce you to a man with what was probably a really, really thankless job. He's a man by the name of Chief Inspector Neuer, who in 1946 worked in the Hamburg Prosecutor's office. Now, we don't actually know that much about Chief Inspector Neuer. His first name is unknown to me. It might as well be Chief Inspector. We don't have any photographs of him either. The Hamburg Prosecutor's Office has actually destroyed its personnel records from this period, so I can't tell you much of anything about Chief Inspector Neuer. But what I can tell you is that in 1946, in a shattered Hamburg that was flattened and burnt by years of Allied bombing, and it's now under the occupation of the British military occupation forces, Chief Inspector Neuer is searching for people. Or in fact, in this case, he's searching for one person. Now, this person had been in the custody of the Hamburg Prosecutor's Office until 1942, when they'd been sent to the concentration camp at Mauthausen. But from there, the Prosecutor's Office had no record as to what had happened to this particular person. Now, Neuer identified this person as one Heinrich Habitz. And knowing that Habitz's mother had lived in Ludwigshafen, he sent a telegram to the Ludwigshafen Kriminalpolizei to ask, and I quote here, when and what has the mother last heard of him, being this Heinrich Eugen Habitz. Now, I admit, when I first read that, I might have been a little bit naive, because the Mauthausen trial was not far away at this point. The Mauthausen trial was a judicial process that was organized by the American occupation forces, in which they placed on trial the camp guards and the camp authorities from the Mauthausen concentration camp. It remains actually the biggest mass death sentence ever inflicted by American authorities. This trial was happening in only a couple of months from when Neuer is writing this. And any number of witnesses will be called to testify as to the brutality of the camp and what had happened there. So perhaps, Chief Inspector Neuer is working here with incomplete and destroyed records. Maybe he has the nightmare of tracking down one person within the Nazi terror apparatus. And I'm thinking of him as being sort of this hard-boiled detective character. He's sitting in a dark and dingy office. He's chain-smoking. He's probably mainlining that sawdust mix of what passed for ersatz coffee at the time. And perhaps he is searching for another witness, or in fact, another victim. Now, in my mind, he had assumed the role of that great fictional trope, the world-weary, hard-bitten detective, the one who is trying to do right by everyone, but hiding it behind that craggy veneer. You can tell that I read a lot of Golden Age detective fiction. So, I mean, Raymond Chandler, eat your heart out here. But Chief Inspector Neuer was going to disappoint me. And this is an object lesson in the fact that as historians, we should never get our hopes up. Next slide, please. Because also in the file was a handwritten memorandum, also by Chief Inspector Neuer. And in this, he actually explains precisely what he's doing. Now, he incorrectly renders the surname of the searched-for individual, this Heinrich Habitz. He accidentally writes it as Habicht, but Neuer lays out the reasons for looking for this person. Habitz, he writes, and I quote here, was judged to be a dangerous sexual criminal, and in brackets, a rent boy, unquote. And then ends this memorandum with the question, jetzt ist die Frage zu entscheiden, ob Habitz wieder gesucht und in Sicherungsverwahrung genommen werden soll. The question is now to be decided whether Habitz should again be pursued and taken into preventative custody. In other words, if this person had survived Mauthausen, their status as a quote-unquote sexual criminal might well justify their being rearrested and being sent once again to prison. So as you can imagine, any idea that I had about the noble side of Chief Inspector Neuer had quickly disappeared. Next slide, please. But who was this dangerous sexual criminal he was hunting down? Well, the record lists the person, as I've said, as Heinrich Eugen Habitz. And about Heinrich Eugen Habitz, we have plenty of information. This, according to the files of the prosecutor's office, was a man whose chief crime was that he was a homosexual and a sex worker. He had been born on the 19th of August 1908 in Ludwigshafen, had trained as a clerk, but had left that job after he fell in love with another man, and had moved to Hamburg in 1929. And why dangerous? Well, the police had arrested Habitz at least 8 times. The common denominator was that one of the charges that so often turned up was under the so-called sodomy law, the Paragraph 175 Reichsstrafgesetzbuch, which is a word I normally can't say, so don't ask me to do that again. But Paragraph 175, of course, was a law that forbade so-called widernatürliche Unzucht, or unnatural indecency, here interpreted as homosexuality. And crucially, Habitz's criminal record shows convictions under Paragraph 175, but usually in conjunction with other crimes. So most notably, paragraph 242, which was petty theft, but also solicitation, so prostitution, sex work. So in spite of the supposed permissiveness of the era of the Weimar Republic, we need to remember that, for one, prostitution, solicitation were in many forms still a crime, as was, in fact, homosexuality. And particularly after the era of the Weimar Republic, and particularly after 1935, the laws against these would only be strengthened and their penalties would become more severe, largely as a result of the Rome affair. And because of this, Habitz was ultimately sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp, and in this instance, Chief Inspector Neuer didn't need to worry about whether or not to go through the drama of trying to rearrest this person, because on the 6th of January 1943, Heinrich Habitz died. So at least goes the paper record. So that's what we have on paper in black and white in front of us. And on the face of it, it's comprehensive. It includes vital statistics. I can tell you the height of this person. I can tell you the weight of this person. Anyone who's a fan here of phrenology, the measuring of the skull, I'm a little bit worried why you're here, please leave. But even if you are still here, I can actually tell you skull measurements. So I have a lot of statistics. I can tell you when the arrest took place, and I can tell you where the arrest took place. But on closer inspection, for a person who lived, there is not very much life in these records. In other words, I see statistics, but I don't see a person. Statistics are very, very poor at telling stories. And as one of my fictional heroes, Doctor Who, is wont to say, we're all stories in the end, so let's make this a good one. And this story, as it turns out, is not only a good one, but it's also only partially about someone called Heinrich Eugen Habitz. Because actually, next slide, please. This is the story of a woman named Liddy Bacroff. The person known to police as a homosexual man was actually a woman, presenting and living as such and understanding herself as such since at least 1929, at least. What is so remarkable about Liddy Bacroff is that she developed her own sense of self. She worked out who she was, largely independent from other influences. So, of course, in this day and age, we would consider Liddy Bacroff to come under the title of a transgender woman. The term, of course, did not exist at the time. Nonetheless, here we have this transgender woman working out precisely who and what she is in a process that today we would probably call self-identification. And what is more, while history has often attempted to seek means of letting the subaltern speak, as we often hear from some historians, Gayatri Spivak, for example, rarely have we had the opportunity to let the subaltern speak, let someone who is normally drowned out in the archive. We've rarely been given such an opportunity to let that person speak in so eloquent a fashion. Because the point is, Liddy left behind a number of semi-autobiographical creative pieces through which we can reconstruct her process of gendered self-discovery. So, if the story is to be a good one, and it is, I promise you, then this evening you won't just hear me telling it, but also, and far more importantly, you'll be hearing it in the words of Liddy Bacroff. Next slide, thank you. Now, what I want to do this evening for the remainder of this talk is three things. I want Liddy to tell her story through three lenses. I want her to tell her story as a woman, as a transgender person, and as a sex worker. But I also want to examine the endurance of the paper identity of Heinrich Habitz, because the authorities' reading of Liddy Bacroff as a man called Heinrich Habitz actually does matter. After all, her fate, eventually being sent to Mauthausen and dying there, came about not because the authorities saw her as a transgender woman, but principally because they saw her as a cisgender homosexual man. Habitz therefore exists in the bureaucracy, and Habitz acts as a tool of oppression for consecutive legal regimes. And the continuation of this Habitz avatar, if you will, into today's archive and remembrance culture acts further to erase and continue doing violence, not just to Liddy Bacroff herself, but to the very concept of transgender identities before the current contemporaneous period, even if that remembrance culture and that active remembrance is well intended. And finally, I want to examine what Liddy Bacroff means, well beyond a self-contained case study. So I want to emphasize here, Liddy should be remembered in her own right. She was a vibrant and dynamic person, and she was a victim of the totalizing and destructive logics of the Nazi regime. But she also provides a window not only into the transgender past, but into how we can understand and approach the transgender present and potentially the future. Next slide. So if we're going to conduct an excursion into transgender history as a whole, we should briefly touch on what is often considered its origin. And as with many concepts of modern queer history, or at least modern queer history in the global north, the global west, Europe, those origins are often traced back to the person here, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, Magnus Hirschfeld, the sexologist who helmed the Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee at the turn of the century, which was the prototypical homophile movement, and would later go on to found the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft in 1919. And the reason we focus so much on Hirschfeld, or the reasons rather, are threefold. The first one, from 1908 onwards, and as a sexologist, he began certifying people who he identified as so-called Transvestiten, as being legitimately Transvestiten. This was essentially a local initiative. So before this, the Berlin police had found themselves dealing with an increasing number of people they viewed, by their understanding, as, and you'll forgive the expression, men dressed as women. And while this wasn't actually illegal, the implications of it were. So the thought process that existed within the Berlin police at the time was as follows. Men are meant to have sex with women. Someone needs to talk to the Berlin police. But anyway, men are supposed to have sex with women. So someone the police identify as a man, but who presents as a woman, can really therefore only be doing so, according to this logic, in order to seek sex from another man, against paragraph 175. However, by presenting in public rather than in private, this person is therefore clearly soliciting. They're trying to find someone who they're not already familiar with in order to have sex with them. This is soliciting. It's against prostitution laws. And because of the fact that they're therefore soliciting while presenting as a woman in public, they're also committing what was termed grober Unfug, or sort of a gross breach of the public peace. So people who we would now likely consider transgender were therefore at risk of persecution and prosecution literally the moment they stepped out the door. What Hirschfeld proposed to the Berlin police was that he could issue medicalized licenses, the so-called Transvestitenscheine, which would certify, again, legitimate Transvestiten, that is, people whom he deemed to be not presenting in the way that they were presenting because of sex work, but in fact from a much deeper impulse than that, as part of what, again, we would now term identity. Now, this impulse he first described formally in his 1910 work, Die Transvestiten, which was subtitled The Erotic Drive to Cross-Dress. But even though Hirschfeld saw this as an erotic drive, he did not necessarily conceive of this simply as a sex act. It wasn't wanton behavior, but it was in fact a compulsion that was deeper within the person themselves. And by 1918, Hirschfeld had modified this position slightly. So in his textbook on sexual pathology in 1918, he recast the Transvestiten less as being similar to the English counterpart term transvestite, which has the implication of simply someone dressing as a member of a different gender, but much more with the idea that gender presentation was a fundamentally integral part of that person's sense of self. Now, the historian Rainer Herrn has more recently argued that Hirschfeld introduced, and I quote here, specific concepts of identity and lifestyle. And this is really what we're sort of seeing in this 1918 reworking of the idea of the Transvestiten. It's certainly much, much closer to our modern conceptualization of gender identity and transgender existence than Hirschfeld had first thought when he wrote Die Transvestiten in 1910. That's our second reason why we focus on Hirschfeld. He writes a lot. The third reason, people know Hirschfeld. He's prominent. He published a lot. And though the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft was smashed in 1933, his magazines and his books endured. The Wissenschaftlich-Humanitäres Komitee, for example, the very idea behind that really became the spiritual forebear of what became the American homophile movement in the 1950s onwards. And Hirschfeld was prolific. Next slide. So that's why we focus on Magnus Hirschfeld, but there are problems with this, and chiefly the biggest problem, I think, is that we forget Hirschfeld's actual role. He's a scientist. That means he conducts empirical research. That means that he reports what he observes. In other words, he's not creating the people he calls Transvestiten. He's simply inventing a vocabulary to describe people who already exist. But in the main, the Transvestiten themselves are not prolific self-publicists. They're not like Magnus Hirschfeld. They're not writing left, right, and center. They don't create their own institute. They don't have their own committee. They're not known around the world. They don't have these international profiles, and their voices are therefore lost. And they're replaced by that of Hirschfeld. And this has real consequences because it effectively hands over control of an emergent transgender narrative to a cisgender gay man. You'll also hopefully have noted Hirschfeld's emphasis on Transvestiten being legitimate if they weren't sex workers. And I'm not going to deal so much with Hirschfeld's idea of sex work here, but suffice it to say, there is something to talk about here with regards sex work, but of this more shortly. And finally, because Hirschfeld was located in Berlin, our focus has invariably been on Berlin as a singular queer locus, and transvestitismus as a particularly Berlin phenomenon. Now, as I knock over everything here, the exhibition that is happening right now here in the America House, of course, challenges this narrative of localization. But our received image of German queer life, and particularly German queer life of the interwar period, tends to begin and end somewhere around Nollendorfplatz. This exhibition speaks more about trans life in Munich. Here I want to speak a bit more about trans life in Hamburg. Next slide, please. On the 13th of March 1930, and here's how I will challenge this, the person who was known to the police as Heinrich Habitz began a 2-month prison sentence for theft. Now this seems pretty ordinary, really. People steal things all the time. But it provoked a so-called criminal biological report or a criminal biological investigation by the Hamburg Prosecutor's office. Now, the reason for this, why would one do this if it's a simple case of theft? Why do we need criminal biological investigation of a thief? The reason was that the person who appeared at the court was listed as male and was listed with the name Heinrich Habitz, but looked like a woman, sounded like a woman, was treated like a woman by their peers. And the crime was the theft of a coat and a dress from a so-called Damenimitator with whom the suspect lived. And the testimony that was provided was that this was a crime of necessity. What necessity? Asks the prosecutor's office. Why would a man called Heinrich Habitz need to steal a dress? This doesn't make sense to the legal minds of Hamburg. And the report that comes out of this is one of only several quite extraordinary documents that I've really had the great fortune of reading in the Staatsarchiv Hansestadt Hamburg. And this is a catalogue of physical and personality characteristics. So I said before, I can tell you height, I can tell you weight, I can tell you skull measurements. This is why. This is because of this report. It goes into more detail that goes beyond measuring skulls and fingers, for that matter. It tells us, for instance, that the adoptive father of the person under investigation enjoyed drinking, but it's okay because the mother was a, quote, good housewife, unquote. It goes into more details about the nightly dreams of the person being investigated, who, of course, as you know by now, is in fact Liddy Bacroff. Liddy Bacroff's dreams are always perverse, according to this report. And I quote here, once he, being Liddy Bacroff, being misgendered here, once he said in a dream to a boyfriend that he wanted to buy him a teddy bear because he needed one to sleep. He was conscious of thinking in the dream that the friend himself should be the teddy bear, unquote. There was a focus on presentation. So again, to quote here, always, as in Liddy Bacroff always, has men with him in dreams and sees himself always in women's clothing, unquote. The unnamed psychologist refers to Liddy Bacroff with female-coded language, even while still using male pronouns, so still calling Liddy Bacroff he, him, but about her speech, lively and garrulous like a magpie. About her facial expressions, lively and mischievous as a backfish. Now, I read this, you'll forgive me not being a native German. When I first read this, in Hamburg, mind you, and I read this, I was like, that's a very Hamburg way of saying that. I was not familiar with this at all. I'm like, just how very Hamburg? I'm sort of expecting that she'll be related to Rollmops or something next. But then I discovered, of course, that backfish is also slang for an adolescent girl. About her gestures, she was girlish. At one point, the psychologist refers to Liddy as a Tänzerin. Of course, the feminine form of the noun dancer. The psychologist also noted that he thinks primarily about love affairs, which in this report is also framed as being a feminine trait. Next slide. But it's not just a psychologist, or at least someone belonging to the state medical department in Hamburg, who is writing about Liddy Bacroff, because at the same time, Liddy Bacroff herself is writing, and this is what I want to spend much more of my attention on today. Not so much someone working for the police telling us who this person is, but the person herself telling us. Between 1930 and 1931, and sometimes while still actually in prison, Liddy Bacroff wrote at least 10 creative writing pieces. I say at least because we definitely have 10. I don't know if there were others that may not have survived or may not have been filed. But of these 10, they all seem to have been written for her own consumption, so they weren't intended to be published anywhere. They were clearly based on her own life, and sometimes clearly more faithfully than others. It is creative writing, after all. The first was written while in prison for the theft of that coat and dress, and is called Freiheit, die Tragödie einer homosexuellen Liebe. Another fascinating point that I just need to point out here is that while I keep saying Liddy Bacroff, at the time that she's writing, she hasn't yet adopted Liddy Bacroff as her name. Instead, she signs her works with an evolving series of names until settling on her most familiar one. So in that first story, in Freiheit, die Tragödie einer homosexuellen Liebe, in that first story, in which her protagonist begins the story as a clerk named Heinz. Remember, of course, that Liddy begins life as a clerk named Heinrich. By the end, the protagonist is a Tänzerin named Litty, L-I-T-T-Y. And Liddy Bacroff signs this work with the name Litty. By the next story, she's added a surname, which is sort of vaguely Dutch sounding. She becomes Litty van Monty. By September, she's become Liddy Bacroff, but she adds the word transvestite afterwards. So it's always Liddy Bacroff, transvestite. And with one exception, for this whole period between 30 and 31, she remains Liddy Bacroff for the remainder of that output, and by August of the next year, so by August 1931, she actually drops the word transvestite from that altogether. So she's finally signing her work simply as Liddy Bacroff. Next slide. Why this happens, this entire journey of the names, becomes clear from her writing, which acts as a guide to this personal journey. Now, it's a very eclectic output. Some stories, such as Garamaro's Opfer or Milo, seem to be anecdotes or character sketches, people she might have met during her life, and she chooses to focus on writing about them and their character. But others, such as Aus meinem Liebesleben, or the aforementioned Freiheit, are much more clearly patterned on her life, such that we can see waypoints of it in the official files we have. And they act as a sort of creative nonfiction memoir, detailing her own experiences and her own development as a person. Now, some themes pervade all of her stories. The most important here, I think, is that of personal discovery and of shaping her own identity and sense of self. This is most explicit in Freiheit, in which the evolution of Heinz into Litty is a clear reflection of Litty's own upbringing, beginning as Heinrich, even down to being jilted by a slightly older male friend. So obviously the same thing happens in the story as actually happens in Liddy's own life. The man she left her job for in Mannheim actually ended up dumping her. Aus meinem Liebesleben is explicitly about Liddy trying on women's clothing for the first time and talking about how it made her feel and how she then navigated those feelings. and how she felt when her mother found out. Now, as the unnamed psychologist noted, another theme that comes through these stories, comes through her life, but also these stories, that theme is men and love affairs, and particularly sex. These are all ever present in these stories. They're clearly central to her sense of who she is. Now, I want to point out she's under no illusion that the sex work that she does, for she is a sex worker, she's under no illusions that this doesn't include exploitation. It doesn't mean that she doesn't enjoy it, however, and she takes to it with gusto. So she's able to balance these two things. She knows that as part of her working life, there is exploitation involved in that, but she also genuinely loves the work that she does. There is also a sense of belonging and community that comes through here and takes many forms. So in Freiheit, she imagines her lover's parents welcoming her into their family with open arms, something that almost certainly wouldn't happen in 1930. In another story, Ein Erlebnis als Transvestit, and then another one, Tragödien und komische Zwischenfälle aus dem allgemeinen Dirnentums, which is a fantastic title, she details her process of entering a community of fellow sex workers, some of whom are cis women, some of whom are transvestiten like her, first in Berlin and then in Hamburg. She writes of camaraderie, and in the latter text, she even goes into some detail explaining the superstitions surrounding sex work, the so-called Hurenglück, or whore's luck. And finally, by seeking community, she also seeks a place and a space in the world, which she finds in the sex district around the Reeperbahn in Hamburg. And from her own words, we can see these evolutions taking place. Next slide, please. In Freiheit, she refers to her protagonist, Heinz, as being, in being, action, and demeanor, much too womanly. With the unspoken addition here, too womanly to be a man. Next slide. Again in Freiheit, Heinz takes a certain thrill from the man they're in love with, Otto, calling them often on the phone and calling them Miss. Ja, Fräulein. When Otto admits that he knows that the person on the other end of the phone is Heinz, but just liked joking, as though Heinz were a female secretary, Heinz replies with, "Well, Otto, perhaps I really am a little miss." In its own way, this is a remarkable statement, a brave statement, and one that might sound very familiar to us in some ways today with the much more modern idea of coming out. Next slide. You can, I hope, see what a treasure trove of material this is and how much fun I have working with it. Because later in Freiheit, Heinz realizes that Otto is, or seems to be, much more in love with the idea rather than the person, in love with the feminine construction of the little miss, and not actually with Heinz themselves. And therefore, Heinz begins to build a new identity, initially as a means to seduce Otto. That new identity is named Liddy, and you can see here Liddy's hope, quote, that he, my Otto, will be falling in love with me, boundlessly in love with me. And the me here is not the clerk Heinz, but the Tänzerin Liddy. Next slide. Liddy Bacroff's second piece takes the form of a creative letter to a paramour named Willi, in which she writes of her affairs. So it's evidently a fairly open relationship. And here she recounts an encounter with a young chauffeur. I quote, "He, the pretty black Edmund, was naturally very surprised by my secret, but even so he loved me sincerely. Edmund often came to me, and he was a cavalier, as he always was with the girls." Now here we see sort of a variation. So whereas in Freiheit, Liddy is portrayed as being an identity that is adopted but gradually blends out Heinz, so Heinz slowly no longer exists, and Liddy begins to be the more important identity. In this work, which is sort of titled Liebste Willi, Liddy Bacroff is clearly here identified as a girl, albeit one with a secret. And given the implication that this secret is discovered during sex with the, quote, pretty black Edmund, that secret is presumably her penis. Next slide. Now, I have no idea whether or not Edmund was based on a real person, so I can't answer that. But what is clear from the writing is that he's intended to be a client. And Liddy's understanding of sex work, as I said before, is unflinching and honest. Now here, she recognizes that as a transvestite, her options of employment and lifestyle are limited in 1930s Germany. So for all of our romanticizing the Weimar period, this is still not a society that fully integrates trans people or gender non-conforming people into its fabric. But she's not resigned to a terrible situation. She sees sex work as both an exploitation, but also a liberation, something that generates a sense of belonging and community, as she demonstrates, next slide please, here. I know that's a lot of text, sorry about that, but I'll go through it a little bit here. So this is from Aus meinem Liebesleben, in which Liddy charts her love life with waypoints that are easily traceable in her own life. And to that end, we can consider her observation here about Hamburg to be her own thoughts. And I quote here, "It has now been 2 years, and I cannot leave Hamburg, the Reeperbahn, the singular St. Pauli. Here I have all that which for me was desire and is now fulfillment. I have good friends or fleeting acquaintances of the night. They come and go. Either such who know me as a transvestite or others who know me as a harlot and address me just like every other in our street," unquote. Here, Liddy speaks to a sort of duality. She acknowledges that some might see her as a transvestite, but she also finds something to identify her in the term harlot, a distinctly female terminology that gives her common ground with the other women who are sex workers in her neighborhood. So beyond telling us about the importance of Hamburg to her story, this description also allows us to exclude one possible angle of Liddy's identity. We cannot, from this, consider her to be a man. It simply is not possible from her own self-description here. Now, whether this is in a liminal transvestite space or being accepted just as, to use the modern terminology, a cisgender woman would be, it is clear that the person Liddy Bacroff is not the person Heinrich Habitz. Next slide, thank you. And unfortunately, as you can probably guess, because these sorts of stories don't end well, I'm afraid, the authorities weren't of the same opinion. So after serving a month in prison in 1931 for breaching paragraph 175, and then a 6-month sentence for petty theft in 1933, Liddy's next brush with the law was in 1935, when she was arrested for stealing 20 marks from one of her clients, who was a sailor named Georg Otto Meyer. And this case offers us some insight into what Liddy's future is going to hold. Meyer had been approached by Liddy while he was on the Reeperbahn at 4 a.m. on New Year's Eve. No prizes for guessing what he's looking for on the Reeperbahn at 4 a.m. on New Year's Eve, even so. She offers him oral sex, which he accepts, and they agree on a price of 2 marks. But when he left, Meyer discovers that he's missing 20 marks from his wallet. The court report tells us, in probably detail that's rather uncomfortable for Meyer himself once this comes to court, that he was preoccupied with, quote, being satisfied by Habitz taking his sexual organ in the mouth. At this opportunity, Habitz took the wallet of Meyer, which contained a 20-mark note, from his trouser pocket. Meyer reports this to the police at the Hauptwache in St. Pauli. Now, we might think it's brave, but also a bit stupid for Meyer to do this, because we know that Liddy will still be seen as a man by the police. We know that paragraph 175 makes male-male sexual relations illegal. We also know that at this period, the paragraph has recently been strengthened after the Rome affair. Thing is, Georg Otto Meyer insists that he had no idea that Liddy Bacroff was anything other than a cis woman. He had no idea that Liddy Bacroff was a transvestite. And indeed, he argues with the police when they tell him that their suspect is someone called Heinrich Habitz. Now, I quoted before from one of Liddy's pieces about the pretty Edmund, who was surprised, but by no means put off by Liddy's secret, in her own words. But it's also true that in real life, her sexual practice protected that secret. So yes, she's a sex worker, but she usually offers her clients oral sex, as in the case of Meyer, or far less often anal sex, but only in total darkness. This limits the possibility that her clients might see her genitals. This is important in just a second, but just very quickly, this particular charge earns her 10 months in prison. Next slide. I said that was important in a second, that she's often able, when conducting her sex work, to hide her genitalia. This is noted by the authorities, and it sets the tone for future interactions with the police. It introduces the idea or the element of deception into the file, that sex happens by deceit here. And this idea, coupled with the strengthened paragraph 175, makes Liddy Bacroff increasingly vulnerable to a now fully Nazified police force. So in 1936, she served her sentence, she's left prison, but she's arrested again. And this time charged under 175, or rather paragraph 175a, Ziffer 4, which was unnatural indecency with the commercial purpose, a new crime that had been created after the scandal with Ernst Röhm. And this time, she receives a prison sentence of 2 years. You can see that these prison sentences are increasing. In 1938, having recently been released, she was seen in the company of a man at a cafe called Comet. And this was reported this was reported to the police by a police informant, and the police go and arrest her for sitting in a cafe with a man. The man in her company, much like Georg Otto Meyer, insists that he was completely unaware that she was anything other than a cis woman. And again, even though in this case no crime has been committed, except for the fact that she is sat in a cafe with a man while presenting as a woman, she's sent to prison again under 175, this time for 3 years. Next slide, please. Now, perhaps reading the cards on the table, Liddy petitioned the court with a very unusual and extraordinary request. She volunteers to be castrated. It's likely, I use the term volunteer here with really big scare quotes over it. It's likely that she believed that this might be viewed by the court as a proactive move, something that the court might think means that she's no longer going to continue her life of what they clearly see as immoral indecency. But it triggers another criminal biological examination, this one conducted by a man named Dr. Wilhelm Reuss, for whom I hope there is a special circle of hell. You'll find out why in a second. Reuss was far less sympathetic, if that's a word I can use here, than his counterpart from the criminal biological investigation in 1930. So Reuss writes a report in which he insists that Liddy Bacroff's indecency is in her, quote, passive pederasty. In other words, her penis is neither here nor there in terms of the crimes she's been convicted of. She's the passive partner, in other words. So it doesn't really matter if she is castrated, because that's not the problem as far as the authorities are concerned. Reus's report to the judges in the criminal chamber in Hamburg is strident. It refers to Liddy's sexual perversion, sexual psychopathy, her moral defects, which Reus feels will not be solved by removing her genitals. Or to quote him here, an emasculation would not, therefore, with absolute certainty, lead to a curative result. Reus's report was damning. You can tell that it's probably not going to go down well for Liddy here. And on the 22nd of August 1938, the Third Criminal Chamber of the State Court of Hamburg issues its final decision. And in part, it reads in a way that will probably sound uncomfortably familiar to us today. Next slide, please. Referring to the idea of deception and drawing from Reus's suggestion that castration would only make it easier for Liddy Bacroff to hide her true nature, the court says he can, through sex with him, entice non-homosexually inclined young people into homosexuality once they notice that he is a man. I feel that especially now, as the right-wing so-called groomer discourse is gaining ground, especially in the United States and in the United Kingdom, we really should look on this language with more than a little alarm, because this, of course, does sound uncomfortably familiar. More explicitly, next slide, please, and I'll quote this at length. There exists the danger that the castration of the defendant will only facilitate his criminal drive. It would make the hiding of his sexual organ from his partners in indecency even easier. He himself has apparently made this application with this point of view in mind, for almost in the same breath he explained to the official expert that one cannot seal his anus. This declaration, too, shows how little the defendant thinks of giving up his desires and how important it therefore is to remove him from the Volksgemeinschaft. Now, if your blood ran cold at that last line, how important it therefore is to remove him from the Volksgemeinschaft, I assure you you're not the only one. Though the sentence, the prison sentence that results from this, was in the first instance only for 3 years, this decision, this declaration that Liddy must be removed from the Volksgemeinschaft was one of no half measures. You don't sort of remove someone from the Volksgemeinschaft or for a little while. It's sort of a permanent measure. What Reus had facilitated, why I curse this man's name in my dreams, what he had facilitated was effectively Liddy Bacroff's death sentence. When her 3 years in prison were done, she was transferred to preventative custody in a prison at Rendsburg before being moved to Mauthausen, where, as we know, on the 6th of January 1943, she died. Her death is listed as being a result of anal suppuration, but officially, as with all the victims at Mauthausen, she's regarded as having been murdered. Next slide, please. And that's where our story today began, with Chief Inspector Neuer trying to find Liddy Bacroff, alias Heinrich Habitz, and discovering that she was, in fact, already dead. And I said that that was an epilogue of sorts, but that's not quite true, because there is a little bit more to the story, and I'm doing okay with time. There is a little bit more to this story, and there will continue to be. So in 2009, the Hamburg historians Ulf Bollmann and Bernhard Rosenkrantz, in researching their book Homosexuellenverfolgung in Hamburg, came across the story of Liddy Bacroff. Now, of course, Bollmann and Rosenkrantz are writing a book about homosexual persecution. Now, in order for Liddy Bacroff to fit into that template of homosexual persecution, they refer to her by her dead name of Heinrich Habitz and with masculine pronouns. Their concession to the Bacroff identity is the title they gave to the subchapter that was devoted to her, which is entitled Liddy Bacroff Hure. Though Bacroff herself never used the normally pejorative description of herself, Hure, and instead preferred Dirne or harlot, or Tante, obviously, literally, aunt. Bernhard Rosenkrantz is the reason, in fact, that there is actually a Stolperstein memorial stone, so that one on the right there. And it does display, as you can see, as you can maybe see, the name Liddy Bacroff there. But the name Heinrich Habitz is obviously far more prominent, and you'll notice as well there are actually quotation marks around Liddy Bacroff there. On the official Stolperstein website, the biography that was written by Rosenkrantz and Bollmann has been adapted, and it now uses the name Liddy Bacroff, and yet it still uses he/him pronouns. Next slide, thank you. The effect remains that Liddy Bacroff is remembered in the Erinnerungskultur as a gay man. And certainly we can't jettison the paper identity of Heinrich Habitz. This, of course, as I said at the start of the talk, is the reason for the persecution of Liddy Bacroff. But it seems to me that by prioritizing this and at best paying lip service to Liddy Bacroff as a transgender woman, we not only lose a profoundly fascinating person, as I hope you'll agree. I hope I haven't bored you to tears tonight. I hope that you've actually listened to this and seen this and thought, this person is fascinating. But what we also do is that we drown out her voice in favor of the voices of her persecutors. We allow them to identify who and what she was. Effectively, we therefore also make her, in part, responsible for her own destruction, because if, after all, we are going to use the definitions that are provided by the authorities that kill her, we are implicitly saying yes to their rationale behind doing so. Next slide, thank you. So to close, I said that I want Liddy Bacroff to offer us a window into both the transgender past and the transgender present, and perhaps the future. And it is here I hope you'll indulge me for maybe 2 minutes more. On the face of it, Liddy Bacroff is an example of what I term the tyranny of the archive and the broader problem of subalternity. So the majority of sources to do with her life can be found in the Staatsarchiv Hamburg. The files are, of course, listed Habitz Heinrich. They include, among other things, naked photographs that were taken during the criminal biological examinations as she was poked and prodded and measured. Royce even made detailed examinations of her testicles, assuming that this must be the source of her indecency and that perhaps that could be traced to them. It's through quite a bit of luck that 10 creative writing pieces have survived in these files, but they were transcribed by court officials as part of her police file. They were implicitly used as evidence against her. And this is how the file keepers, in keeping these archival records, intended them to be read. Now, even the best-intentioned historians, and here I don't want to suggest that I'm casting aspersions on the intentions of people like Bollmann and Rosenkrantz, because after all, it is thanks to Bollmann and Rosenkrantz that there is even a little bit of public remembrance of Liddy Bacroff. But even they have foregrounded this persecutory rationale in the remembrance of Liddy. And further, and much more broadly, we can have a tendency to become lost in methodological and theoretical frameworks. And this, I think, can be shown very much in what I mentioned earlier, the mystification of the figure of Magnus Hirschfeld. But Liddy Bacroff is someone who, independent of Magnus Hirschfeld, and as far as we know, unlikely to be familiar with his work beyond perhaps the term transvestite, She was not a visitor to the Institute for Sexual Science. She crafted her own understanding and conceptualization of herself without the help of Hirschfeld. She did it in a confident way. She did it in a creative way. And she evolved that sense of self from Liddy to a transvestite, to a harlot or a tante, or purely as a woman named Liddy Bacroff. And what this is pure lived experience and pure self-identification, aspects of transgender identity that are once more battlefields of cultural wars. And these are cultural wars now that insist that there is an incompatibility of trans rights with other rights. Finding terrifying voice in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and if the pathological transphobia that's employed in certain press organs and other institutions are anything to go by, then even in Germany again as well. Now, I could end with the quote I sort of facetiously used at one point, that Doctor Who quote, "We're all stories in the end," and certainly we've told the story tonight. I could end with a quote from the unnamed psychologist who remarked from the outside looking in on Liddy. But I think Liddy Bacroff has earned the last word to talk about what she called, quote, "the nature of my being," unquote. And what was that nature? Well, it wasn't a criminal. It wasn't a pervert. It wasn't a deviant man. It wasn't a gay man. It was a woman. And above all, a romantic who, next slide please, not long after being released from prison in 1930 wrote, and I quote here, "What is now an unbreakable conviction is that love is, remains, and will always be mortal, for death cannot kiss." And with that, thank you very much.